Today, we're going to talk about the story of Moses. And in your Bible, the story of Moses actually takes us to the next book. It starts at Exodus 1, and it goes all the way through the book of Exodus through to Deuteronomy. And in your Spark Bible, it's page 66. Now remember, when the Hebrews were in Egypt, there was a new Pharaoh. And this new Pharaoh didn't remember all of the good things that Joseph and the Hebrews had done many years before. And now this new Pharaoh had enslaved the Hebrews. But the slaves were starting to get too great in number, so he put out a decree, a rule that said all of the Hebrew babies under a certain age, all of the boys were to be killed. There was a woman who had a baby, and she decided to hide him. She put him in a cradle and covered it with reeds. And she told her older daughter Miriam to take the baby and float him out on the river Nile by where the Pharaoh's daughter and other people from her household would go swimming and get washed. And she thought maybe one of them would find him and would take care of him. Well, Miriam was very crafty, and she hid herself in the reeds and waited until she saw the Pharaoh's daughter and then floated the basket out to her. Pharaoh's daughter found the baby and decided she was going to keep the baby, and she named him Moses, which means drawn from the water. Moses grew up in the royal household with other members of the royal family. He didn't know until he was much older that he was actually a Hebrew. When he found out he was a Hebrew, he decided that he wanted to help the other slaves in Egypt. This didn't go over very well with the Pharaoh. And even though the Pharaoh loved Moses, he always thought of him as a son, he wouldn't let the people go. Terrible things started to happen. Moses came very close to God and prayed to him for help. And all of these terrible things started to happen, one by one. And eventually, the Pharaoh said that the people could go. Let the Hebrews go if all of this bad stuff will happen. So Moses led the people out of Egypt, and they crossed over the waters. They were running from the Pharaoh's army. They crossed over the water out of Egypt into the desert, into the big empty desert, away from the safety of the Nile. Many of these people, they had been there for a long time. They didn't know anything else, but they followed Moses through the water. And they were in the desert, and they didn't know where to go. And every time they got somewhere, God said, keep going. So they kept going until one day, Moses would go off by himself to pray. And he came to a place, and there was a bush that was on fire. But the bush wasn't burning, it was just on fire. And he heard the voice of God, and the voice told him what to do. It told him that they would find peace and a place to stay in the land of Canaan, and that they needed to keep going. So Moses came down from the bush, and he told the people that they were going to have to keep wandering around in the desert. They didn't really want to hear this, but he said, don't worry. And at night he would go out off on his own and pray. And God said he would take care of them. And he sent manna, which they could make into bread. And there were quail that they could use for food, because otherwise there wasn't a whole lot in the desert to take care of them. So they had their manna and their quail, but the people still weren't happy. They said, what are we supposed to do out here in the desert? So Moses went over to some rocks, and he took his staff and he hit the rocks, and water flowed out. And he said, see, God will take care of us. He sent us this manna, and he sent us this water, and he's going to take care of us. Now Moses would often go off by himself to pray. And he went up into the mountains that were on the edge of the desert, up into Mount Sinai. And God gave him rules, commandments, things he wanted to teach the people, how they could be the people of God, because they wouldn't be able to enter back into their promised land unless they knew what to do. But when Moses came down from the mountain, he saw the people. He had been gone for a while, and they had built an idol, a golden idol that they were worshiping. They thought that that was more important to do than to just worship God. And Moses got angry, and he took the tablets and he smashed them. And he said, these were the rules that God gave us to show us how to get into the promised land, but we don't deserve it. We're not ready yet. So he took the golden idol away, and they kept going in the desert. And then Moses went back. He went back to talk to God, and God gave him the rules again. And he said, go down to the people and tell them. But because of what they did, you'll never get to enter the promised land, but they'll get to enter the promised land. So Moses went down and he told the people, he shared with them the rules, the 10 best ways that God wanted them to live. And they built an ark, a box, to carry the commandments around in. So wherever they went, they would be protected and they would have them to study. And they built a tabernacle, a tent around the ark until they were in their permanent home and could build a temple. Moses saw the promised land. He saw it in the distance, but he wasn't able to enter. And after Moses died, the people entered into the promised land, and they took the ark with the 10 commandments in it into the promised land, and they were able to build a temple. And that's where they stayed. All of the people of God, the 12 families that had come out of the water in Egypt, they followed Moses, who trusted God. And every time they needed something, God gave it to them. It wasn't always something they wanted. They got a little bit sick of the manna. They got a little bit sick of the quails. But it always took care of what they needed until they were able to enter and following the rules that let them go into the promised land.